Hi, good evening, everyone. I'd just like to start by welcoming JR Thorp and Nadine O'Regan to the stage, please. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Dublin Book Festival event, whether you're here with us in person or whether you're watching from the comfort of your own home. My name is Emer Hurley and I'm the Festival Director of West Cork Literary Festival. I'm absolutely delighted to be involved in this year's Dublin Book Festival and to be here in person in front of a live audience and also the audience at home. I'd like to thank Julianne from Dublin Book Festival for inviting us to take part this year and to commend them on putting on so many amazing events and so many in-person events at this, very strangest of times. So it's such a huge honour to be involved this year. When Julianne contacted me and asked me to programme an event at the festival, it seemed appropriate to look for a Cork angle. And so we selected an Australian librettist and writer, JR Thorp, who lives in Cork, and whose debut novel, Learwife, was published by Canongate last week, and journalist and broadcaster Nadine O'Regan, who lives in Dublin but who grew up in West Cork. We really do love Cork, sorry. I make no apologies. Many of you will know Nadine. She's the editor of the Business Post magazine, as well as their head of podcasting, and she has chaired many events for West Cork Literary Festival and Dublin Book Festival in the past, so I'm really excited to be here for tonight's event, and I'd now like to hand you over to Nadine and to Jennifer, and I wish you all a marvellous event, whether you're here with us in person or at home.
Emer, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I hope just to start that everyone can hear me all right? All good? Good. Well, my name is Nadine O'Regan and I am delighted to welcome you to this event presented by the West Cork Literary Festival in association with the Dublin Book Festival and, of course, with the wonderful author JR Thorp, or as I think friends and family know her, Jennifer Thorp. So Jennifer is the author of the debut novel Learwife, which has as its premise a really fascinating concept. It takes the story of the wife from King Lear, and actually a story that doesn't exist because King Lear, in the play, I think there are maybe 2 lines about Learwife, as she's known in this book, but it's an idea that I suppose is about telling untold tales and about bringing new expression to female characters who were perhaps passed over in older works of fiction. Now, of course, the women that we know from the Shakespearean tragedy are Regan, Cordelia, Goneril, who are asked by King Lear how much they love him, and he asks them this with a view to divvying up his kingdom, and whoever loves him the most will get the great share. And as we know through the story passed down from the 1600s, Cordelia is the one who leaves with nothing. Their story has passed through the generations, but what of Learwife? Well, this particular book, Jennifer, just to say, it's you've been chosen as one of the Observer's best debut novelists, and already with just a matter of weeks post-publication, the reviews have been coming in and they've been extraordinary. So I want to get to that and I want to hear a little bit about your background. But before we do all that, can you take me to the why of this book? Why King Lear, and why take this story, this untold story of this particular woman?
Well, I've always loved, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Thank you all for coming, by the way, including people on the live stream. I've always loved retellings and rewritings and underwritings and things that take old or classic ideas and shift them in new ways. So like Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, one of my very favourite books growing up. And I had always looked at King Lear as a complete play, but about 6 years ago I started thinking about the particular absence of the wife. And I was very interested, but I thought, oh, this must be something that, Shakespeare decided to write out for various reasons. There are many characters in the play. Possibly he decided that this one wasn't relevant. But I looked back and I looked at his source text, which is Geoffrey of Monmouth's Histories, no wife in there either, and it got me thinking, what was this woman like? You know, because in the play she has two references, one very obliquely and one slightly more specifically, but there's not anything else. And King Lear for me is such a strong family story. It's a story about a really corrupted, damaged family, and there's a key player missing in that damage. And that was what really got me interested.
This was 6 years ago, at a time pre-pandemic and at a time when you had already established another very successful career. The art of writing fiction and the art of starting to write fiction, the way of the young writer is an arduous one, because it requires a huge amount of self-belief and possibly the ego to put something on the page, but also the insecurity to go back and check your words and see how you're getting on, and then maybe pass it around to others. So to take the base text of King Lear, did that provide you with almost a wonderful point of imagination from which to sort of bring forward your own creation, that it actually felt like supportive to you?
It did. Supportive, and yet also kind of an opportunity, because there was so little there. But there were these very rich characters on which to draw as kind of a framework for, you know, these, when we meet Regan and Goneril and Cordelia, they're adults. They have lived their whole lives in this dynamic of clearly being asked to prove how much they love Lear and performing it, and the whole action of the play starts because Cordelia, for the first time, clearly says, no, I'm not playing anymore. And that provided this really great field of inspiration, but also, you know, the world of the play, the world of fealty and courts and subterfuge and people, you know, competing for power. That was a really great inspiration as well, and that the many different kinds of power find a lot of direction in the book.
Can you tell us a little bit about exactly where your narrative starts?
It starts just after the play ends. So everyone is dead. Spoiler, I guess, for the 1600-year-old play. Everyone is dead except for Kent, as we know, but Learwife doesn't. And she is in an abbey. She's been in an abbey for 15 years for a crime that she doesn't understand. No one ever explained it to her. And she was exiled there by Lear when her daughters were really very young. And the play ends and the novel begins when she finds out that they are dead.
Yeah. And would you like to maybe read an extract now, perhaps somewhere close to the opening?
Yeah, sure. So this is from a section about Learwife's married life with Lear and with Kent, who is in the novel part of her married life all through her life. He's one of her oldest friends. And how her relationship with both Lear and Kent kind of develops. How can I explain this to the abbess, to any person who lived without witnessing, the shift and pull of love and where it lies? Lear and I were only a year married, and the horse was too wild, had been ridden barely, and that by the horseboy Sutton, who was unskilled, and it paced and breathed and was a black line against the sand, and tossed wet locks off its neck. Even when young, Lear dropped our advice from him, as if it was so much ballast that prevented him from rising into air. He liked lively ones, he said. To take a higher animal and dismantle its will to obedience was a skill and a virtue before God. We saw. He rode it till the nostrils were awash with foam, and its wind was broken, but it would not give. King and horse battled down the riverbank, wrestling over slate stone, he whipping and invoking gods while the hoofs struck fire, until they rode together at a great leap into the wild white water, where the horse screamed and fought for purchase. They rolled and cleaved apart in the arms of the river and went under, and I ran to the bank and Kent beside me, and Kent saw, and my hands were in the water. I was in the water. I would breathe the underside of air to save this. It was Kent who stripped and dived and rose, streaming, water parting over his hairless body with the dead king, my husband, and brought him on his shoulder to the bank, as I was hauled in by women. Waist deep I had gone, my legs already fins, my throat a flashing gill, death wet to my stomach in my fine queen lace. Which, they said, but dried me so. And then, when Lear rose in breath, not dead, but dreaming a king dream underwater, he said later, full of sons who gazed like coral. He looked only for me, and said my name, and came for my hands, and wept. Kent in the river still, naked to the waist, who had withstood doom like a terrible effigy. But Lear and I were locked, seen by and seeing only the other, and kneeling in the wilderness, on the grey stone by the river, while the ferns blurred. Love and love and love. Kent breathing unnoticed, while they hauled the bloodied body of the horse in downstream to retrieve the swollen leather, bright insignia of the king. Who can explain this? Devotion to a king in all its forms and how it binds.
Beautiful. Jennifer, one of the things that's so evident from that reading is that your day-to-day language is not at all similar to the language that is employed for this book. And it seems to me that you had to enter a world of altered syntax and using words like cleaved and words that perhaps we don't often come across in everyday discourse. So did you plunge into the old texts to almost channel that kind of language?
I did. I also spent quite a lot of time with modern poets who employ that kind of language very richly and to great effect, like the Mercian hymns of Geoffrey, I've forgotten his name, someone will correct me, or, in his own way, Seamus Heaney, people who, particularly who call on kind of liturgical or Christian words that we don't necessarily use that much anymore to bring forth new meaning. And it was always very important to me that it didn't sound stagey or like someone was strutting on stage in a frill and saying, and declaiming things, because that would immediately take people out of the novel. They'd be like, this sounds odd, and now I'm going to put this down. So I wanted it to be rich, but still wash over you seamlessly.
Yeah.
And that was the really hard bit.
Yeah, and it's something that a number of contemporary novelists have done to such great effect. You think of Sarah Waters or other novelists that have gone back in time and offered not only a contemporary take on maybe an older story, but also found that in-between of language whereby there's enough clarity that the reader can happily make their way through it, but that the gestures to the older time are still very, very evident. I wonder, did you run it by any scholars? Did you talk to family or friends? Did you quote paragraphs at them and say, is this the right tone?
Funnily enough, my husband is a medievalist. He's an expert on medieval Italian poetry. I married very well. And so I always had a resource, not only for primary texts about, the book takes place mostly in an abbey, what life was like in a medieval abbey, the kind of the rhythm of days, things like that, but also for, does this sound right? Does this resound correctly? But as it is, a lot of the book remained kind of close to home until I'd produced quite a lot of it. And then I had some really fantastic readers, like my husband, like Jing Li, who gave the wonderful quote on the front, and various other people who really helped bring it together as a coherent piece of work.
One of the things that I think everybody who's read the book and even heard about the book have been really interested in is the rewriting of an older work, not the rewriting, but maybe to use a Marvel comic kind of thing, the rebooting of King Lear to tell a feminist version of events that are maybe are taking up the tale. Were you very conscious of that you were reclaiming an unknown female voice?
I was very intent on creating a character who felt real as a woman and claimed a lot of time and a lot of space as a woman, who was unlikable in a lot of ways, but also very tender, very sympathetic in others. And I think that's part of the real project of feminist rewritings and stuff that tries to pull up gaps from the canon and make people pay attention to them, is that there is so much space for more stories about women doing interesting things and being complex. And I know that complex female characters is now a shorthand for, which basically means that someone, looks good in a jacket and also punches people. But,
Like Scarlett Johansson and Black Widow kind of vibe?
Yeah. But, that's kind of, that was very much on my mind, is I want this woman to feel real. I want people to go, even if I don't know this woman, I see into her head, I understand her, she feels like a realistic person.
Yeah.
And that was the best service I could kind of do. To the text.
One of the things that's very interesting as you read the book is the power dynamic that exists between her and the nuns surrounding her in the abbey, because she has been banished essentially. Lear doesn't want her. She is so confused. She's alone in the world except for her handmaid, and yet she feels better than everyone else around her. She feels above them, and yet she's sort of in exile. And the power dynamic around that, and the observation of strata, if you like, between the upstairs downstairs almost vibe, is very present in the book. And was that something that was very important to you, that you wanted to show that though she is a queen in exile, she remains, in her own opinion at the very least, above, beyond, and almost of a different species to those who are surrounding her?
Oh yeah, that was, well, the point of view of medieval people in general was that there were hierarchies of being, and that kings and queens were almost a different class of human. In Christian kingship, they were viewed as direct links to God often. And I've made Lear kind of more of a pagan king who's got an even more direct, role to play in the religious universe of the world. And it's also a very good way to show someone taking power in a situation is if they truly believe that they are inherently the most powerful person in that situation, the most superior person, even if they have no power at all, they're always going to bring something interesting to the table. They're going to walk into the room and something's going to happen. And that was very good as kind of a storytelling thing of being like, the queen, even if she has nothing left to her except her idea of her rank, that's it. She still carries herself, she still believes herself to be a queen. And she is going to cause trouble because of that, and she does.
She certainly does. Well, it's not her first marriage either. I mean, Lear was her second. And when they marry, I think I'm right in thinking he was 18 and she was 25. So there was a little bit of an element of she was older and wiser as well. And was that of interest to you, the younger man, the older woman, and then getting kicked out, essentially?
Well, I wanted her to be kind of an expert on statecraft. That's what she sort of brought to the marriage, that they loved each other, but also she had all of these ideas about power and manipulation from her life in court that she could teach him. And for that, I borrowed a little bit from the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who also was married multiple times, very young, and who accumulated knowledge through the marriages and took it all into her own life as she moved on. And for Learwife, it was very much, she's had this first marriage, hasn't gone very well, that's not really a spoiler, but she's accumulated so much understanding of power and how to manipulate it as a queen, as a person in the court, and that's what Leah sees. Leah sees, a woman and an opportunity. And that's the relationship they kind of have.
It struck me that a lot of people will read the book trying to find out what the daughters are really like, you know, because everybody thinks about the daughters a lot, you know, and Cordelia has a very special status as kind of the good daughter, if you like, the honest daughter. And as the book is told from the perspective of their mother. So did you want to take a stance on how she feels about them in a very particular way?
I wanted to kind of pull together this childhood that might explain what they were like when we finally meet them in the very famous play. Because all of them, including Cordelia, they're all married, you know, by the end of the first scene. And they've clearly had these very long lives, but we don't have any understanding, except vaguely, about what that was like. And what better vehicle to examine that than a mother figure who may have contributed heavily to the way that they ended up, whether she realizes it or not.
Yeah. And in relation to the play itself, when you were growing up, were you very conscious of that play? Because I can tell you, as the fourth of four girls, I was conscious of that play. You know, the story is so writ large on the consciousness of so many women growing up, because the tale, which is so old and has resonated through the years and that which we study in school, tells you unequivocally that women are not rated. And it's not even a point of contention in the play, you know. And actually in the book, you describe how Lear and his queen went in search of potions or salves, or they did incantations, anything to bring forth into the world the boy. And the failure of that was the grand failure that everyone was so obviously aware of. But when you were a kid growing up, you were near Sydney, Australia.
Yeah.
Did you have a consciousness of that play very early on?
I think my big introduction to it was in high school. In Australia, you do something called the HSC, or the Higher School Certificate, which is a bit like A-levels, and that was what we studied. We studied King Lear, and it was a really interesting way of looking at it, because you looked at different productions of it and how they had managed to manipulate it in different ways to make it about different things. So about statecraft, or about family, or about whatever. And there was one very kind of interesting absence there as well, aside from the Queen, which was a son. There is no son in there. There's Gloucester, who has two, and that ends badly. And Lear very, very visibly has none, and all of this kind of longing for a son is kind of left unsaid in its own weird way. But I think I was actually first aware of it because of an Agatha Christie story called The Moving Finger, in which there is a character called Megan, who herself has a very terrible family situation, who just says as an offhand line, "I've always wondered why Regan and Goneril were like that." And when I read that as a teenager, and Christie does this very cleverly, she puts these little things in the mouths of her characters and they say a lot. And I remember reading that and thinking, you know, as a teenager, that is a very interesting question, because no one in the play questions it. It's just, they're evil. Regan and Goneril are bad people, and it's their fault, and then they die, and that's their fault. But the wider kind of ecosystem of that family, and, you know, why are they like that and Cordelia like she is? There are so many questions that the play kind of leaves you to wonder about. And that's where that started, really.
And did you come from a large family?
No, I only have one older brother, who is not a writer. He is a charity consultant, but he's very proud of me.
Did you have a sense early on as a reader that women were left out to some extent in fiction? Because certainly when I was growing up and studying fiction, even in college, there was a marked absence of female authors in the textbooks, and certainly what I read was predominantly male growing up, whereas now, to be honest, and not through any design, but because it's available to me, the majority of what I read is by female authors. But you know, at a certain point, And I think particularly actually in maybe the 90s, when the Booker Prize was, you know, really a very big deal. It still is a big deal, but not in the same way. But male authors were really, really prominent on the lists, on the prize lists. So there was a certain kind of cachet associated with this idea of the male novelist writing the big male novel. And as a reader, female or male, you were just sort of almost intended to appreciate that, and there was a silence perhaps around the work by the female. So did that strike you early on?
It was really interesting because I was quite a bookish child, and so people would buy me compendiums or things about the canon, or this is a list of there's a collection of, for instance, interviews in the Paris Review. Right? You can buy a huge compendium of them. And, you know, people's reviews of like the best poems ever written, 100 best poems in English. And I was in my early teens when I started to notice just how few women were in those things and started to get really annoyed about it. And people around me didn't necessarily understand why, because I loved those books. I was so interested. But once it's there, you can't forget about it. Once it's present in your mind, it's visible and you can't look away. And it's something that I've been very conscious of moving forward, which is why I'm so kind of proud also to be part of this moment with Silence of the Girls and Circe and all these other stuff, where a lot of female authors are telling female stories that have been neglected in broader texts. And it feels like there's this sort of wave that we're all on, where people are interested and people are really hungry for these new perspectives. It feels wonderful. It's really, really great.
Well, I don't want to embarrass you, but you know, you were actually a pretty bright spark at school. I mean, you finished secondary school at 16, right? And you actually skipped grades. So it would be pretty hard to deny your ability at any level when you were growing up. So what was that like? You know, were you in a mixed school actually? Were you just flying ahead?
I was in an all-girls school. Being what they kind of call a gifted child is, a lot of people have written a lot more about this very eloquently, but it is one of those things where it's very good and it's very bad, because intellectually you can go as far ahead as you like, but there are no exams you can ace to get better social skills. You just can't. So you just have to learn as you go. And also some things about literary analysis you can't learn early. I think that's a sort of the difference between, this is my opinion, between skipping grades in maths or whatever and skipping grades in English, is that there's some sophistication of thinking and reading that you just have to get under your belt. You know, it's very difficult to push through when you're young. And that was the sort of the push and pull of it. Is I was much happier moving forward because I was at the right level and I was with, you know, people who were talking about the same stuff. But there's some stuff you just have to go through at the time you go through it.
A lot of people would say that they write because they felt a little bit like an outsider in society. And I would imagine that if you were sitting there with people who were older than you and acing the tests, that however wonderful it might feel to be gifted, it might also feel a little bit difficult or isolating.
A little bit. It's also that people talk about it in ways that don't necessarily feel true because you didn't kind of ask for it. It just is the way that you are. You know, it's I suppose like being born wealthy or something. It just is what it is. And so getting a lot of praise for it can feel a bit odd, if that makes sense. But being slightly out of kilter with things is also kind of helpful, because I'm sure a lot of other writers feel like this. You get another perspective. You're not necessarily, even though you're out of step, that being slightly out of step lets you look at things from a slightly broader perspective, even if you desperately want to fit in, which I always did. You still get this extra, I guess it comes as an advantage later on, but, you know, pluses and minuses.
Yeah. Well, you went to the University of Sydney and then you wound up heading to Oxford for a period and then Cork. So how'd that all happen?
So I went to Oxford to do a master's in creative writing, and that's where I met my husband. So I stayed, which is how it often happens. And I did a PhD at the University of Manchester with Vona Groark and John McAuliffe, both amazing Irish poets. And then purely by coincidence, my husband got a job at University College Cork. And so we've been over here for 3 years, and it's wonderful. It's one of the places in the world that is most similar to Australia, not in climate, but in perspective, and also in the amount
Would you say it's the best county?
Also, people swear about the same amount, which is really helpful.
I think this is like live stream versus, geographical space. We have to be a bit careful here.
Please don't mob me. I promise everyone's nice.
And by the way, just for anyone who's watching on the live stream, just to say we will have a moment for questions. So if you want to submit a question, hopefully someone will be able to come in to deliver those to me shortly. And likewise, if you have any questions in the audience here, please do get them ready. But Cork, so you got to Cork, you've 2 cats.
Yes.
And named after?
Named after medieval nuns.
What are they?
I know what I like. Hildegard von Bingen, who was a tiny, terrifyingly bright tortoiseshell, and Jutta, who was Hildegard von Bingen's kind of protector and mentor, who is a slightly older white cat who is... We didn't anticipate just how much of a kind of a stupid snowball she was, but she is a big stupid snowball. No disrespect to Jutta the nun. But yeah, we live in Cork. We have 2 cats, and it's delightful, and we really don't ever want to leave.
And obviously you've come such a distance. And actually, one of the things I didn't say about the book, but there's a point in the book where the sort of illness strikes, and it's eerily reminiscent of COVID-19, and I know this book was written prior to obviously the pandemic, but did you look back at the drafts when you were ready for publication and think, my God, how did I manage this?
Well, I had a couple of questions so the book came out on the 4th, and I've had a couple of press interviews where they were like, did you insert that during COVID? And I was like, no, it has been written, it was in there for at least like 4 years beforehand. But we were doing the final copy edits during COVID, and that was a weird experience because it felt kind of like a proof of concept. Like we were reading about what life was like in an enclosed space during a plague. And it was like, is this how people really responded? Is this true to life? And luckily, a lot of it seems to actually ring true. But, I didn't prophesy the plague, I'm sorry. I didn't do it on purpose.
And for you in Cork, you have obviously got family in Australia, and you've moved around, as I was mentioning. So did it feel very, very difficult? Because obviously Australia had a very tight restriction policy, and you were living in, Cork is such a small city, and I guess it must have felt the distance must have felt so much greater when you knew that your capacity to actually get home if you wanted to was so curtailed.
It was really difficult. I was actually really lucky in that I was out in Australia to see my family in March 2020, February, March. I got back into Ireland the day before the borders closed. I could have been stuck in Australia, with my family, whom I love, but without my husband, without any of support over here, till now, basically. This is the earliest point at which the borders have reopened. So it's a very kind of sliding doors thing as well. But it has been really difficult, particularly because a lot of my friends and family are in Melbourne, which has had 7 lockdowns. And with the time zone, it's very much, you're trying to sympathise and you're trying to create, cement bonds and keep everyone kind of connected. But when they're half a world away, it's never felt more like half a world, I suppose. Yeah. It's never felt further.
And we were speaking actually before we came out here about how, this is my first live in-person event since the the onset of the pandemic, everything has been via Zoom, and for you, this is
the first in-person event for this book I have ever done. So thank you very much for everyone coming out. I'm so glad.
How does it feel bringing out a book in late pandemic?
It was supposed to come out in April, is the thing. It was pushed back to November because the numbers in April were not good, and they just went, look, we would like this to have a better chance of, going out and being promoted in the world, so we're going to push it back to November. So this could have been a very different story. I think it's more of a winter book. It's set in winter. There's a lot of kind of wintry things that happen. There's Michaelmas. I think it would be one of those things that it might be a difficult beach read, but it's a good Christmas read. So I think it's all worked out. But
yeah. And for you as a writer, for some people, their work was just extraordinarily curtailed. I mean, obviously live performance, theatre practitioners, musicians, their livelihood has just been so drastically affected. But I suppose one of the virtues of being a writer is that you can go to your study and to your office and dream up something new. But you do a lot of commission-based work. So how did that work for you? Because obviously you're involved in the opera world as well.
That was really hard because I work, my other sort of side of creative things is I write libretti and lyrics, so words for opera and for singers, and that all just went away. And it wasn't so much sad for me, it was sad for the performers who, that's their livelihood. There was so much devastation in that industry, it's going to take a very long time for it to recover. And things are starting to pick up again. I just did a really lovely commission for the Environmental Agency, the UK Environmental Agency, for some pieces in Glasgow, which were sung by school children who basically just yelled very, very loudly about bees and had a wonderful time. There's nothing quite like hearing 30 very small children go buzz very, very loudly. It's very cute. But it's coming back. But yeah, it's been a very long, dark time. Yeah.
Well, we might open it up to the floor now for a question, if anyone would like to raise a hand. Yes? You want to?
A question and a half, I suppose. I'll start with the half question. I wondered if you'd read Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres?
I have. Isn't it an amazing book?
I agree. And I wondered what you thought of the depiction of the wife of the Lear figure in that book. I know she's quite a shadowy figure and she doesn't appear much, but she's the only literary Learwife I can think of in your own.
I thought that Smiley did a really excellent job because she kind of stays true to the power of the play in that in the forefront of the drama are these three daughters and the father, and they take up all the space. They take up all of the narrative, and this woman is sort of pushed back or steps back is the other side of it. And that was, for me, really, really interesting as a potential way of viewing it. If you hadn't read A Thousand Acres, you absolutely should. It is brilliant. Yeah. I read it in one go on a flight from London to Australia once. That is a distracting place to read. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
And did you have another question? Or yeah, you're good.
No, that was
Oh, brilliant. And anyone else with a question? I might read one actually from the live stream just while you're thinking there. So Deirdre asked...
Hi, Deirdre.
Hello, Deirdre. Asked, do you think you'll write another novel, and what story would you like to retell if you were to write another retelling?
I've had this question quite a lot, and there are so many interesting possibilities, but also because we're in this kind of brilliant moment of lots of these things coming out, I can guarantee that anything that I think about or I mention, some other brilliant author has it in process. Like that's guaranteed. So I'm going to throw out into the world, I think somebody somewhere should write a really, really good retelling of Grendel's mother from Beowulf. I think that would be amazing because she is this incredibly important figure in kind of epic poetry history. But what we've had in modern retellings has been Angelina Jolie in that slightly peculiar Beowulf film. which takes it all very sideways and makes her seduce people. And that's not really, it's one way to look at it, but I think it could go in a lot of other very interesting ways. So if anyone's looking for a free retelling idea, take it and run.
Okay. And another question, do you see any modern echoes of the Lear story?
I mean, Succession is a big, well, it's kind of this enduring fascination with really warped families and how they deal with power. And of course, Succession is based on the Murdoch family, who are Australian, and I apologise for Murdoch. And also, interestingly, another kind of Australian power, family of intense power and a lot of drama is the Packer family, who are not as well known over here. But it's very much the same level of intense wealth and brutal inter-family, intergenerational fighting. This stuff just happens continually. When there is family and there is wealth and there is power, things are going to crack up against each other. It's going to happen. And so I think this is part of why Lear has endured for so long, is people always look at it and go, I see this. I recognize this. I know how this goes. Even if the thing that they're fighting over is a general store or, you know, something very small and that doesn't seem very significant. It's why there have been so many really good retellings of Lear as well.
Yeah, it keeps hold of the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Is there another question there from the audience? Anyone just raise a hand? One question that I had actually, and we'll finish up in the next few minutes, but it's just the idea of, I suppose, furthering your career in this world. You've already been so successful. Is there a great vulnerability attached to the publishing of a novel when you already have, you know, a wonderful setup, a great academic career already at your back, and to go out into the world and actually say to people, here is my book, here is my debut novel? Does that vulnerability seize you from time to time? Because when you're not a seasoned novelist, you don't know what people are going to say or think.
This whole process has been completely terrifying. I'm not going to lie. But it's also, this is what I've always wanted to do. The libretti and the lyrics have been kind of an accident because I say yes to things even if I don't necessarily know how to do them. So someone said, let's write some lyrics. And I went, okay, I will learn how to do that. But the novel has always been something that I really, really wanted. I really wanted to put a good one out into the world is the thing. So I worked really, really hard to make sure that this was something I could be really proud of. Even in 40 years, I look back and go, this is my first novel. This is my first stab at it. This was as good as I could do. And that is really hard. But, you know, it's not necessarily all about the praise or the reviews, even though those are wonderful. What I'm really enjoying is people getting in touch and being like, oh, this book, I loved it. I dropped it in the bath because I was so excited. Like that sort of stuff is because it's just been sitting with me for so long. And I'm so excited that people are taking it out into the world and really liking it.
And the Shakespeare scholars?
They are also a bit...
in the bath.
Well, wonderfully, there's been this really good response when the RSC is doing a giveaway from it, the Globe Theatre is doing a giveaway from it, there's an Institute of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Birmingham who really like it, and I was slightly worried that I was going to get a lot of very angry, well, as angry as academic emails kind of get, you know, very passive-aggressive.
Was it Richard Ford who, when he got a bad review, he went out and he shot the newspaper?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I was a bit worried about that, but thus far, I mean, I've been very clear that it is not a scholarly take on. It's just imaginative. But thus far, people have been really responding to it, and that includes the scholarly community, and that's been unexpectedly nice.
Yeah. And as I was mentioning at the start, you were chosen by The Observer as one of the year's best debut novelists, which is a huge accolade coming from them. And the book has also earned comparisons with the work of Margaret Atwood and Maggie O'Farrell. And honestly, it's hard to do better than that. So how has that felt?
I think it'll sink in about 2025. Because it's just been this pile in my house for so long. You know, it's been this thing that I've put all this work into, and now it's out and people are looking at it, and that still feels, particularly in a pandemic when it's all still feels very virtual, that bit doesn't feel real yet. But to say I'm flattered and kind of flabbergasted is massive understatement. It doesn't really get better than that, does it?
No, but then you've got the difficult second album now to do.
Oh,
so.
God, yeah. I know.
Well, listen, Jennifer, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And, there is a question. So we'll go to a question before we close up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just an admission, I haven't read King Lear, so I've read other Shakespeare plays, but not that one. So what would you say to somebody who hasn't read King Lear? How should they approach the novel, or what should they expect?
Well, the good thing is that precisely for this reason, I've included a summary of the play on the first page. So just for that reason, if you haven't read King Lear, it's in there for you. Just a very basic, there is a king, there are 3 daughters, everyone ends up dead. So if you haven't read King Lear, don't feel like you have to be able to enjoy the novel. It is basically just a novel about a woman who thoroughly believes in her own power, causing a lot of chaos among a lot of other women, sometimes very funnily and sometimes very tragically. And you don't have to be an expert on Shakespeare or even have ever seen Lear to understand it, and I was very careful about that. It's not full of lots of in-jokes or anything like that. But yes, there's a cheat sheet. It's there for you. It will all be fine.
That's a great question. And anyone else? All right, well, I think... Oh.
If you want to say, I had a very brief question. What are the main mistakes that you think authors today make when writing female characters? I know that's a really general one, but what mistakes do you think authors today make when writing female characters?
I see. Sorry, I didn't hear half of it. Yeah.
Sorry.
I think it's a really tricky question because there's so much going on in modern literature. But I think we're at this really hopeful point where we're moving forward. We're moving past putting female characters in boxes or requiring them to be likable, requiring them to not take risks or, always to have something that connects them to an audience. And we're kind of moving to the point where people are really willing to go along with a character who maybe is doing really, really annoying or despicable or difficult things, but people are going with them. And that, I think, is really hopeful, because Learwife is kind of unlikable, but she's also very real. And that there's so much more space for this at the moment, and will continue to be more space for it in the future.
Great. Well, the book is called Learwife. It's out now by JR Thorp, and we didn't mention this, but there's a Jennifer Thorp, which is why it's JR, right?
Yeah, she's an expert in 17th century dance. She's been publishing for far longer than I have. She gets first rights.
So this is why you need to look up JR rather than Jennifer. But Jennifer, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you, and I'm delighted to be here myself. I'm part of the West Cork Literary Festival with the Dublin Books Festival, and thank you, all of you, for being here this evening, and thank you to everyone on the live stream. Pleasure to have you with us as well. And with that, we'll just say thanks very much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
What a marvellous event, and I can highly recommend Learwife. It's a brilliant read, and I would recommend that you all read it. Jennifer has already signed copies for the Festival Bookshop, which is the Gutter Bookshop, which is across the road if you go out through this door. And for those of you tuning in from home, we would strongly encourage you to support your own local bookshop wherever you're living. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dublin Book Festival for putting on this event and all the other brilliant events this week. You guys, our audience, for coming out here tonight, and everybody tuning in from home. And most especially to thank Nadine O'Regan and JR Thorp for such a brilliant event tonight.
Okay.